Hi, my name is Erin and I am a genetic counselor at Geisinger, and I want to welcome you to our first main session. And this session is going to be a panel-based session, and it's really going to be focused on the act of becoming involved in ClinGen, what we can accomplish when we all work together, and how we can improve in that process. We're actually going to divide this 2-hour block into 2 different 1-hour panels. The first is going to be co-moderated by myself and my colleague Marina DiStefano, and it's really going to be focused on GCEPs and VCEPs. And then in the second hour, which will be moderated by Courtney Thaxton, we're going to be focusing on our contributors and just some insights into why they choose to volunteer their time and resources with ClinGen. So we do have some questions prepared for our panelists, but please feel free to type your own questions into the chat. And between the 3 of us, we will all be keeping an eye on the chat, and we will incorporate those questions as we are able. So with that, I will just give you a little bit of background information on our first panel. So again, this is really going to be focused on building and maintaining our gene curation expert panels, or GCEPs, and our variant curation panels, or VCEPs. So while these are certainly not our only curation activities, they are indeed the largest in terms of people power. And I know that a lot of people in the audience either participate on either GCEPs or VCEPs or are thinking of doing so in the future. So during this first hour, we're going to speak to chairs and co-chairs of our different expert panels and get their perspectives on, again, building and maintaining those expert panels. And with that, I'm just going to share my screen and show you a few brief slides that we've prepared. So just to refresh everyone's memory, we did have a few expert panels with us when we first started ClinGen, but really around 2017 was when we first started keeping track of the growth and maintenance of these expert panels. So you can see, prior to 2017, we had less than 10 of each GCEPs and VCEPs, and we've steadily increased those numbers over time. In terms of the gene curation expert panels, we currently have 39 different GCEPs. And together they have completed over 1,300 different curations encompassing over 1,000 different genes. In terms of the scope of what the current GCEPs are interested in, over 3,800 different unique genes are within the scope for our current GCEPs, and at least 900 of these have been listed as being of interest by multiple GCEPs.
Just to parallel that and speak a little bit to the variant curation expert panels, these are the approved variant curation expert panels and their total variants in the evidence repository. So those are most likely the ones that are submitted to ClinVar. As of right now, there are 2,141 variants that are live in ClinVar from expert panels in ClinGen. And right now there are 43 total VCEPs. Next slide. The full scope, so 39 genes are in scope for the 15 currently approved VCEPs. So those are the ones that are approved to submit to ClinVar and have finished their specifications. And 188 genes are in scope for all variant curation expert panels that are going through the entire process of all the steps.
And with that, we would like to introduce you to our panelists for today. So representing GCEPs, we have Zi Lua from Baylor College of Medicine, and he is the coordinator for the hereditary cancer GCEP. And this GCEP has been working since February 2019 and was initially focused on well-described cancer predisposition genes and their major associated syndromes. This group will also oversee the recuration of hereditary cancer genes previously curated by older cancer-focused GCEPs, which are now inactive. We are also joined by Christian Schaff, who is a professor and chairman of the Institute of Human Genetics at Heidelberg University and a visiting professor at Baylor College of Medicine. He's the co-chair of the Intellectual Disability and Autism GCEP, which has been active since 2017. This group's focused on evaluating the approximately 1,000 genes implicated in intellectual disability and/or autism. We also have Christy Lee, who is a genetic counselor at the University of North Carolina. She is the coordinator of the Retina GCEP, which has been active for approximately the last year. This group's initial focus is on the approximately 100 genes associated with both syndromic and non-syndromic forms of retinopathy. And finally, we have Allison Coffey of Illumina, who is the co-chair of the Syndromic Disorders GCEP. And this group's been active since May 2020 and is focused on both well-described syndromic disorders that are frequently tested in clinical laboratories, as well as new gene-disease relationships which have been identified by either clinical exome or genome sequencing or by the Centers for Mendelian Genomics.
So to introduce the VCEP panelists, first we have David Wu, MD PhD of University of Washington in Seattle, who is a molecular pathologist and co-chair of the myeloid malignancy VCEP. This group has been active since 2018 and is focused on genes associated with hereditary myeloid malignancies. They've received full approval for their first gene, RUNX1, and are working on rules for a second gene, GATA2. At least 4 other genes are within the group's planned scope. Angshmoy Roy, MD PhD of Baylor College of Medicine, is co-chair of the NTRK Fusion Somatic Cancer VCEP. This group has been active for the past 1.5 years and is focused on neurotrophic receptor tyrosine kinase fusions, which are well-recognized oncogenic drivers in various pediatric and adult malignancies. The group's draft specifications are currently under review. Brooke Paulus of the University of North Carolina is the coordinator of the limb-girdle muscular dystrophy VCEP. This group has been active for the past 1.5 years and is focused on 7 autosomal recessive genes associated with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, a group of chronically progressive disorders characterized by proximal limb-girdle pattern muscle weakness and wasting. The group is currently in step 2 of the VCEP process, developing their specifications to the ACMG AMP guidelines. And Catherine Rader of Duke University is the co-chair of the Lysosomal Storage Disorders VCEP. This group has been active since 2017. They've previously completed the VCEP application process for their first gene, GAA, associated with Pompe disease, and recently received approval for an updated version 2.0 of those specifications. The group is beginning to start the process for a second gene, IDUA, associated with mucopolysaccharidosis type 1.
All right, and with that, we can get started with our panel. So again, most of these questions can be answered by either GCEP representatives or VCEP representatives. So just feel free, anyone, to answer this first question. But one of the first and most important steps in forming a ClinGen expert panel is actually identifying who's going to serve on such panel. So how did you identify individuals for your expert panels, and how do you really navigate the process of making sure you have the right people? If your clinical domain is broad, how did you ensure that you got accurate representation from different groups, or if there's any kind of disagreements or different factions among experts? I'd be curious to hear how people navigated those things.
So Erin, maybe I'll start. As you mentioned, I'm co-chairing the ID Autism group. Generally speaking, I would say it has not been an issue or not been a major challenge to recruit people. We actually get a lot of people who approach us, expressing their interest in joining the group. But in the early days, I personally asked PhD students, co-workers, molecular geneticists, and physicians who deal with the issues of ID and autism personally, and ask them if they would join. Also, when I present our work and talk about ClinGen at conferences, etc., usually I have one slide where I mention that if someone in the audience is interested, that they should contact us. And I think it's a fairly straightforward process. You can go through the website and express your interest, and you'll be directed to the right group.
I think it was similar for us. So this is Alison, and I'm co-chair of the Syndromic Disorders GCEP, which is slightly different from the other ClinGen GCEPs in terms of we don't have a specific disease we're focused on, but really covering a really wide range across all of the clinical domains. So for us, we approached again, colleagues and people that we knew had an interest in syndromic disorders and in rare disease, and tried to get as broad a set of expertise as we possibly could. We also wanted to target clinical laboratories who are doing genetic testing of rare disease to sort of so that we were covering what was coming through the door and what people were seeing in clinics. And we also approached people, so people like from Omen, Mondo, to have that kind of input into our GCEP. But then I think we were really trying to go broad, so we deliberately targeted people who sort of studied animal models and functional experts. And I think I would say the same as you. We very much would encourage more people to join us. We're a reasonably large panel, but I think considering the broad scope, we do need to have that wide range of expertise. But we wanted people who are seeing patients in clinic and in sort of general clinics, so that they're seeing across the range that we're trying to curate for. And I should say actually both Marina and Brooke are actually on the GCEP. So the Syndromics GCEP has got this panel loaded.
Wonderful. And then did someone from a VCEP want to comment on that question? Just because I know the VCEP has maybe a few more specifications on what types of people need to be included.
Sure.
So I'll comment. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'll go and then you. I just want to say we also wanted to keep our panel fairly broad and make sure that we had both clinical, or all three, clinical, molecular and biochemical experts, because lysosomal storage disease, there's often, in a lot of the metabolic disorders, there's that component as well. So we wanted to make sure we had broad expertise. And also because some of our disorders would be included on newborn screening panels, we also wanted to make sure we involved people from that aspect as well.
Thank you. My name is David Wu with the myeloid malignancy. We had the same approach. We were sponsored by the American Society of Hematology to look at specific genes relating to myeloid malignancy. And our interest was really to invite clinicians and molecular pathologists, both from academics and commercial laboratories, because we did want to capture the scope of testing that was happening. In particular cases, we reached out to basic scientists for their expertise to help us devise specific rules. And so we did take a similar comprehensive approach to make sure that we could see all angles of the variants in the gene that we were considering.
And this is Anshuma, if I may add, a very similar approach. This is for the NTRK somatic cancer fusion VCEP. And this being a somatic focused variant curation expert panel, we did focus a bit on reaching out to clinical colleagues, especially clinicians who are engaged with treating these patients with these particular fusions, or running clinical trials in which these fusions have been assessed for response to therapy. We also tried to make it very broad and had pathologists and molecular pathologists, as well as clinical geneticists. And like others mentioned, we did not have really any issues with recruiting members. There were a lot of members who approached us wishing to join the group. And we also reached out at different meetings, like the AMP meeting or the Cancer Genomics Consortium meetings, and we're able to recruit a lot of other individuals as well.
Great, thank you for all those wonderful answers. And just a reminder to the audience, if you have any questions for the panel, feel free to stick them in the Q&A chat box, and we will alternate between our pre-written questions and those questions. So to go to one question from the audience, do you get to a point where you have enough members and don't have the capacity to accept more?
Christian, would you like to answer that and tell what we've done in that regard?
So I guess what's kind of special about our group is that we have the daunting task of curating 1,000 genes. And, we've made some progress over the past 4 years, but still there's so many genes to go. And in order to increase our output, and because the group had been growing significantly, we actually decided at some point, maybe a year or 1.5 years ago, to split into 2 groups, which has 2 advantages. A, we're able to accommodate more people, and B, we're increasing our output.
Wonderful. Okay, let's move on to another question. So this is once again for GCEPs and VCEPs. How did you come up with your gene list? Can you speak to some of the sources you queried? How have you decided to add or subtract over time? And how did you choose to prioritize them?
So I can start. The Retina group used the Genomics Panel app from the UK. And there's a panel that they have been working on for eye diseases. And so we started there, and that includes retinal genes in addition to many other types of eye diseases. And so we were able to kind of call the genes that really didn't fit under retinal dystrophies. They also, if you're not familiar with the Genomics England panel app, they use a stoplight feature, green, red, and amber, where they prioritize genes that maybe should be on or should be considered for clinical panels as their green list. So for our around 100 genes, those are on their green list. And of course, we'll be hitting their amber and probably red list as well, which will add to our number. But we started there so we could get the most clinically relevant genes. And the other way we needed to whittle down our list was, as you can imagine, retina overlaps with many other GCEPs and ClinGen. And so many of our genes had already been curated by other groups. So we needed to take those off the list. And then several were on the same groups as other GCEPs. We can tell that by using the Gene Tracker app. So with those, in those instances, we decided that where retina was really the primary feature across the syndrome, and maybe the other group's feature was more of a secondary feature or present sometimes, that maybe we should be the group to curate that gene. And then for many of our genes were, say, renal, which is where we have a lot of overlap, where renal is the main feature, and retina is sometimes seen, sometimes not seen, that maybe renal should do that gene instead of us. So those are just some ways that we prioritized. But our main backbone of the list came from the Genomics England app, panel app.
So from the VCEP perspective for the LGMD VCEP, we selected 7 LGMD genes, and we selected these genes based on clinical utility, as well as, since major responsibility of the VCEP is to specify the ACMG guidelines. When choosing those 7 genes, we really wanted to select genes that would kind of fall in the same categories for those specifications. So genes that have a similar clinical phenotype, similar function, perhaps were in similar pathways. And we did start with 8 genes and then removed 1 gene because it was looking like that gene was going to have a completely separate set of specifications that would not kind of fit in with our other 7 genes. So those were some of the things that we considered when looking at our gene list for a VCEP, which of course will be much smaller than for a GCEP.
The hereditary cancer GCEP first focus on curating well-described cancer predisposition genes for their major associated syndromes. So we developed our list based on the 114 cancer predisposition genes identified in Nathan Raman's Nature paper in 2014. And now we have almost completed genes on this list, and if there are other genes proposed with high risk to cancer, we will also curate them. And the next major focus of the hereditary cancer GCEP is to recurate the colon cancer and breast ovarian cancer genes that were curated by the 2 inactive GCEP over 3 years ago. And they were using old version of SOP. The curation were not performed in GCI and didn't follow the lumping and splitting guidelines. So there's a requirement for our clinical development level general GCEP to recurate those genes for gene curation. And the definitive genes are the high priority because we want to curate the major gene disease relationships first. And previous moderate and strong curations are also high priority because we want to check updates to determine their current classifications.
Allison, would you also like to comment on this one? Because it sounded like the syndromic disorders had an interesting kind of pipeline for deciding what genes they were going to evaluate.
Definitely, thank you. And I'd like to say this work was done very much in collaboration with Marina at the time. We were setting up this GCEP, and we had sort of 3 groups of genes we were looking at. So we wanted to choose genes that would be sort of very relevant and have a high impact across the community. And part of this was looking at standardization in test panels of the different labs that tested for different genes associated with syndromic conditions. So we took the approach of looking at the genetic testing registry and ordered those genes prioritized by the number of times they were tested for in the genetic testing registry, and then combined that with looking at the number of pathogenic and likely pathogenics in ClinVar for those genes to hopefully identify the genes that would have most impact. Now that was a very long list. I think we ran into several hundreds and hundreds. So although I think we said we've got 71 in scope, we've got plenty more lined up waiting for us in sort of future years. Then the second group, and this is what had actually one of the things that prompted us setting up the GCEP was, as a clinical lab, we do ClinGen gene curation as part of our interpretation reporting process. And we were looking at the genes that we were curating and realized, and we very much wanted to share our data and wanted to do that through the ClinGen process. And in looking at it, we realized that it was something like 42% of the genes we were curating weren't covered by existing GCEPs, and they were the ones that were growing it. And so we kind of thought that, okay, well, this is a good group of genes that we should be looking at and getting out there into public domain via ClinGen, because they're not going to be seen or treated necessarily by the GCEPs focusing on just specific organ systems or, you know, without the syndromic presentation. And then we also wanted to capture what you see in a lot of rare disease, of these new GDRs that are coming out really frequently. So I think we had 3 approaches to put together our gene list. And I think we've got 71 scheduled at the moment that we're working through. We've got 11 published. We're actually done 27. I just think we've done a few more than we've managed to get published so far. But it's proven to be a very interesting list, because we're finding that we are curating a lot of quite a few sort of traditional definitive genes, and then going all the way to the other end of those that are only seen, you know, very rarely. So we've got quite a scope of classifications. The other piece I was going to say is that we are very actively, and we also use the ClinGen tracker to drop genes that already were on other people's lists. And we're very actively, we've been in discussions, I think 3 or 4 GCEPs, we've swapped genes or we've co-curated, because I think there are a lot of genes that people have on their list that when they re-look, they think, well, actually, perhaps this is syndromic. And we've certainly got a few through to the pre-curation stage, and we thought, actually, this may be better suited. We need more disease expertise in this. So I think that's something that we try to be very proactive in. But yes, it's a slightly different approach when you're accepting genes across the clinical spectrum. Anything to add, Marina? I have to say, big thanks, Marina, to her postdoc for helping generate that list. It was a really big piece of work.
Awesome. Let's move to a question from the audience now. So it sounds like this question is written for GCEPs, but I think it could also apply to VCEPs. So I'd like to hear at least one answer from both perspectives. So does everyone in the group have to agree on the curation before it gets published or posted? Or does one or several people look at the work of others and then kind of okays it or denies it? So maybe if we could hear from at least one GCEP and then someone from a VCEP talking about your final review process of variants.
So basically, one of the members of the group, will curate the gene, and then when the work is done, that gene curation is presented in the group call. And during the group call, we discuss the evidence that was found, and we discuss any open questions or matters of disagreement. Oftentimes, we can agree on the decision and the final curation during the call, but occasionally we get into a situation where some open questions remain, and we'll give it back to the curator and ask to collect some additional evidence or kind of reassess some pieces of evidence. And then we may either sign off online when that is completed, or we will bring it up in a future call again. It's an interesting question. Does everybody have to agree? it never seemed like an issue to agree, because it's not really a matter of opinion, but it's a matter of evidence. So sometimes little pieces of evidence are missing, and once they collected, automatically everybody agrees.
Thanks. And maybe either Catherine or David, since you guys have approved VCEPs.
I'll go ahead and share it. We've had a very positive experience with our variants. We do have very talented biocurators that pull data and present them to us. I would say I don't remember a lot of contentious arguments or discussions about things, and it is very much the case wherein once the data are collected and put together, the variants fall through and we all agree. So we've not yet had that experience yet in terms of disagreement. I think the data are collected and put together nicely. I think there have been some difficult variants that we've come across for which we then needed to seek additional information as to how to think about the variants. But we've not, to my recollection, approved variants for which there was, partial disagreement in terms of how to classify them.
And I'll agree with everything that the folks have said, that it's pretty much the data. It's a data-driven process, and that's the nice thing about it. We were using kind of one method where we had two curators independently, more or less, curate the variant, and then we had two experts look at that curation and agree or disagree. And if there was any disagreement, those calls were discussed, or those interpretations were discussed on a group call, on a regularly scheduled call. If there was disagreement, but if everyone kind of agreed, then the curation was considered, done. We, I think, are now in the process with version 2 of going to a slightly different format where there's one curator who does the curation and then 3 experts who will look at it. So there's some different ways of doing that, and it can be for easy variants, there's kind of one pathway, and then for more difficult variants, there can be other pathways where you feel like you need to get more people's opinions on the interpretation of the data. So.
All right, thank you. All right, so next from our prepared list of questions, so this might be a very broad question, but I'll kind of try to divvy it up for you. So is there any advice that you could give on the process of creating either a GCEP or VCEP that you wish you knew from the beginning? And specifically, I'll call on maybe our younger groups, so like retina, syndromic, and tract fusions and limb girdle, on your thoughts about launching a group and then getting ramped up. And then from our older groups, so ID autism or myeloid malignancy, hereditary cancer, and the LSD group, your thoughts on any tips you wish you had about maintaining momentum. So younger groups, any thoughts? Retina, syndromic, NTRK, or limb girdle?
I think that when we were setting this up, I wished I'd had a better idea. I wished I'd sort of had a better idea of how to manage my expectations in terms of it's a very straightforward process, and we were very well supported in setting the GCEP up, I felt. But I hadn't appreciated how long it would take us to get going. So I think if I'd knowing that might be useful, might be useful to appreciate sort of the length of the process. And then I think also having a more realistic idea of, and I think I have to say the advice was shared, having a realistic idea of what we could achieve per month, and sort of having, that's the kind of advice I would give to people. I think initially I thought we would be able to do way more per month than is actually practical. So I think that was a piece of advice that was given that was good to have. So that's something I would pass on to somebody else setting it up. But I have to say, we were given very good advice throughout the whole process.
How about you, Angshmoy?
I was struggling to think about what I might say, but I do want to echo what was said by Alison. I think we have the same experience. Having a better understanding of the entire process by the whole group, and how long this process might take in each of these individual steps, given almost everyone is a volunteer, we had to really think through this and understand what can be expected on a monthly call and on a commitment of a partial time commitment by each of our experts as well as the curators. And I think 1.5 years later, we are in a better position to understand how much we can make progress over time. So I think this is probably through practice that you can gain. I'm not sure this can be transferred to any other panel because everyone's situation is different. However, that I do want to echo that, and I think that has been very useful for us to get a handle on.
Okay, for our more well-established groups, what do you wish you knew about maintaining momentum? Maybe I'll ask Z your thoughts on this first.
Yeah, for GCEP, I think the volunteer curators from community are very helpful because there are a lot of curation work in gene curation. And also a senior experienced curator or coordinator who is familiar with the ClinGen gene curation framework is also very important to lead effort, train other curators, and also control the curation quality. So I think a good connection and communication with ClinGen gene curation working group and other GCEP is also very important to keep updates with new ClinGen general recommendations and some update in SOP or change in the curation interface. Yeah, that's also, I think, is an important point.
If I may add, I think it's really important to remember that all of us do this voluntarily, right? So it's not something that we have to do, but that we choose to do. So it's really important that we enjoy this work. And because of that, if you are considering to launch a new group or start a new group, it's important to pick a co-chair you really enjoy working with. And the work with the coordinators who really run the show and keep everything together, and your co-chair, is so important because, we are responsible to make this a good, positive, and fun experience. On the other hand, if there are challenges that you face, it's important to voice them early. So get together with your co-chairs and your coordinator and discuss, what are your options in order to solve any issues that you might have that may kind of leave you dissatisfied.
Wonderful. Those are some pretty insightful answers. So just to speak to one of the previous questions we had about approval processes, Sharon did point out, and this is something good to mention, that for variant curation expert panels, particularly because ClinGen has an FDA approved database within ClinVar, there are some requirements as to the number of approval individuals for approving variants. So to just point you towards the variant SOP to be able to refer to that for some of your procedures if you're just starting. So another question from the audience, and this is for ID autism, so I might even actually turn to Erin for this, because they're asking if for the 1,000 gene list, you're planning on curating variants across all of those genes. And so I wondered if you could potentially speak to some of the variant curation expert panels, because this is a GCEP that Christian is representing, that are getting started within ID autism.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So actually the VCEPs that we have up and running in the neurodevelopmental space are actually more focused on epilepsy and brain malformations at this time. We do have one specifically focused on an intellectual disability phenotype, the Rett and Angelman-like disorders phenotype, but they're just focused on a set of approximately 7 genes with that specific presentation. But in the next round of funding, we are looking at trying to draw up perhaps a broader VCEP that could tackle some of these more well-known neurodevelopmental disorders.
Great, thanks, Erin. So to move on to the next question, and this could be for GCEPs or VCEPs, do you feel that you're adequately connected to ClinGen? You are on this panel, so that might skew that answer. But are you, for example, are you made aware when there are changes in policy or procedure, when there are relevant learning opportunities or events? and if your work area is adequately publicized within ClinGen? And do you have any suggestions for improvement in this area?
Just to give a little bit of context, I think, we saw from the welcome slides earlier, we have over 1,700 different people working on ClinGen in some capacity or other. And as we get larger and larger, at least, from the core staff side, sometimes it feels a little difficult to make sure we are conveying information and keeping good relationships with each of our expert panels. So we just wanted to get your thoughts on how that process is going for you.
I think the coordinators do a fabulous job of keeping us connected and up to date. So I can't say enough about having a wonderful coordinator or expert curator on your panel. Feel like we rely on them a lot. Another thing that has kind of helped us stay well connected is we fall under the metabolism work group as well. So we have monthly metabolism calls where we have members of each of the VCEPs. So it's kind of another layer of connectedness. So we aren't an island, we're really feel like part of that group. So that has been helpful for us.
I would like to say the role of the coordinators in doing, we have two excellent coordinators who I feel really keep us well connected and up to date, and as well as some of the ClinGen framework experts that are part of our group. It's an interesting, so we do have curators and members in our GCEP and members of other GCEPs, so we kind of keep track between GCEPs that way. I think that's very powerful, but it would be interesting, like this retreat, I think this is a great opportunity to have people from different GCEPs mixing and exchanging their ideas, because that's something that in the day-to-day running of the GCEP, that doesn't happen, because typically it'd be the coordinators who are coordinating exchange of genes between groups. So I'm probably not talking many of the other co-chairs or the other people apart from the other GCEPs I'm involved in. So I think that's something that would be great to have some kind of more interaction at that level, as you just described for the VCEPs at that sort of higher level. But absolutely can't praise the ClinGen coordinators enough. They do a superb job, and we would be lost without them. I'm pretty sure every GCEP and VCEP would say that. There would be no GCEPs or VCEPs without our coordinators.
I want to say that as well. Without the coordinators, we really would be lost. And I think ClinGen, also the fact that as a somatic VCEP, having a ClinGen somatic clinical domain working group has been very helpful. We have a broader sense of where we belong in that context. And we have those regular meetings every month, getting a sense of which other somatic VCEPs are being formed or being proposed, and being able to be connected with them has been very helpful. Also, I think ClinGen does a fantastic job in terms of keeping us informed through newsletters, mailing lists. I also want to say that the fact that the website is actually fairly well maintained and updated, and gives a fairly clear insight into who are the members and who are the coordinators, including the documents on the website. So yeah, I think in short, we do feel connected. There probably are other ways to increase the connectivity and interchange and collaboration ideas. Yes.
Well, thank you for all of that praise. This is very lovely to hear. I'm glad that you guys feel relatively connected, even though we are getting so large. With that, I will switch over to a question from the audience, and this was written specifically as a VCEP question, but again, I do think GCEP representatives can also weigh in. The question is, approximately how many biocurators does each group have? And if you know, what's the breakdown between people, full-time, part-time, volunteer, paid, and has this kind of changed over time? So maybe, David, I'll ask you first from the VCEP perspective, if you know that information about your group.
So we're a little bit unique in that when we launched, we had special support from the American Society of Hematology to help support and fund the coordinators and the biocurators that we have in our program. I think one of the long-term challenges is to make sure that there is enough support, both time as well as funding, to make this whole process run. It's great to think about, for example, 1,000 genes and 50,000 variants, but that becomes, a challenge to get to. I mean, we're not doing that scale, but I can't even imagine. We've been privileged to have funding support in that regard, and so that's been able to support partial salaries to do that work. We are in a transition phase now where we are looking to bring on new folks, and so this is a work in progress for us. But I do think long-term it is a challenge for each of the groups to think about how do you maintain the quality of time that one can commit and devote to this, and how do you bring people in so that they can feel like they can contribute and be valued for their time and expertise. So I'd love to hear what other people might be able to share here.
Brooke, what about you? How is it in limb-girdle?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think the number of biocurators for each VCEP will really depend on the stage that VCEP is in. So the LGMD VCEP is currently in step 2, which is the ACMG specifications. And for LGMD, the specification process is primarily powered by the experts and is led by one senior staff biocurator from ClinGen. So we have maybe a couple other biocurators, one staff and maybe 2 volunteers. And up to this point, they have not really been engaging in the production of work and have been more serving to learn and listen, as our experts are the ones who are kind of doing the data collection and putting together the specifications. But I am also on other groups where the biocurators are really involved in the process of putting together the specifications, but it is not necessarily a requirement to have a lot of biocurators at the step 2.
Yeah, I would agree with Brooke. It really depends on the stage of your VCEP. And I've been known to joke with my groups to say, the more curators we have, the more work we can get done. I would think there's probably a number that's too many for a VCEP. I don't know what that number is, and it's going to be dependent on if you have some paid staff in addition to volunteers. If you had all volunteers, you'd probably want more biocurators so that you can spread out the work a little better. If you had more funding and could give some effort for people to devote more time to curation, then you would need fewer. So it's a great question, but it's difficult to put like a number too. I will say, comparing VCEPs to GCEPs, you need a lot more for GCEPs, and you need them from the get-go. So unlike the VCEPs, where there is sort of a ramp up period and a learning period that can happen with the GCEPs, you're getting up to work pretty quickly right after training. And the work can be time consuming, especially for newer biocurators that are learning the process. And so we don't want to burn anyone out. We want everyone to stay, and like Christian said, enjoy ClinGen. And so we really need a lot of biocurators if we don't have funding for staff biocurators, so that we don't burn out people. And what I like to do with my groups is have a curation assigned maybe every other month, and then vary them between genes that would be known definitive and probably don't need a presentation on our calls, versus giving them ones that may not reach that definitive classification and need more discussion on a call, so that I can try to vary that for everybody, in addition to working with different experts on the group so that they can experience working with lots of different variety of experts on our groups. So it's a great question, but it's really hard to give you an exact answer.
I like to say, at least from the GCEP perspective, I know that this question was asked for VCEPs, but for GCEPs, I like to tell new groups that they should plan for at least 6 biocurators to kind of do exactly what Christy was saying, allow people to rotate on and off so that not every curator has an assignment for every call. And we, at least in the neurodevelopmental space, have been very pleased with our volunteer biocurators. And I'll just put in a plug for the next panel, which will be focused entirely on our, will be focused, at least in part, excuse me, on our volunteer program. And you'll hear from Courtney some information about how that is going, and from some of our volunteers on how they feel that it's going. So with that, I'll segue to the next question, which is, what do you consider to be the metrics of success for your expert panel? So, obviously number of curations could be one, but I'm really more interested to hear about if there are other metrics of success besides that, if there are other things your group is trying to accomplish, and what steps you're taking to accomplish those things.
I can take a stab at it. We are fairly new, and we are also relatively new in the space in terms of developing something for the somatic rules. I would say that one of the interests in our group is to see if specifications developed by this group may be able to serve as a template for some of the other somatic VCEPs that are being proposed or are being formed, and especially in the area of gene fusions in cancers. We are discussing with the CBI whether or not this could be it's obviously not going to be the same, but can act as a template. And so that's one of the interest areas for the VCEP. Of course, putting those rules into a publication is one of our key goals, and we are working on one of them right now. So, other than curations, I can think of these two as some of our goals.
I would say similarly, having achieving the goals you set out in terms of the number of curations, but I think also one of the metrics of success for us would be that level of engagement and attracting others, everybody enjoying the work that they're doing and learning from it, and allowing us, we have got our own sort of additional scoring guide that we developed, but allowing us to improve that, and then perhaps feedback some of that to continue development of the framework itself, where there are some adjustments that could be made. So I think there's metrics of success can come from all different areas, and I think it's not just the numbers, it's the enjoyment, the engagement, and what it's giving to the community is something I think is very important for us, and sharing data that otherwise wouldn't be shared. I think that's a success.
Great, that's really helpful. So I'm going to move on to a VCEP specific question now. How did you approach working through your variant specifications? Are there any tips you can provide that may help expedite any specifications? This can be appropriate for the younger groups and also the approved groups.
Sure, so I can answer this. So as I mentioned previously, for the LGMD VCEP, this group is really powered by the enthusiasm and knowledge of our experts. And what we did was we have one senior biocurator who is leading and guiding the efforts, and she has broken down the criteria into different groups for specifications. So such as like phenotypes, functional assays, computational, population databases. So codes that can kind of be specified together. And then we had our experts sign up to work on the criteria based on their area of expertise, so they can be using their knowledge in the best way possible. And then those experts actually met in small groups outside of the monthly VCEP time to discuss and put together a preliminary specification that they then present to the group and gather feedback from the group and have a further discussion. And I guess I don't necessarily have any particular advice, but I think that one thing that is interesting is to try to consider how different VCEPs go about the specification process, because different approaches will work differently for many different types of groups. And when looking into the best method, I found it interesting to consider what other groups are doing and how I can use other groups' protocols for my own groups.
As the other younger VCEP, I would like to say that we did, even though we did not have any somatic cancer VCEP protocol to follow, we did rely quite a bit on the germline protocols and tried to borrow not only the approach, but also the layout and the framework as much as we could. And then we started working on developing specifications that are focused on the NTRK genes and fusions based on clinical assessment and feedback from clinical laboratorians and diagnosticians. We then performed a crosswalk with the existing guidelines from AMP, ASCO, and CAP for somatic variant classification and identified what is overlapping, where are the gaps. And of course, once you've identified those, you can identify if those needs to be further specified versus the gaps need to be filled. So this was more of a stepwise process, and we also benefited quite a bit during this process by communicating with the Cancer Variant Interpretation Committee, and we had going back and forth feedback, which helped us kind of formulate our specifications.
Having had one set of specifications approved and curating some variants, and now pausing and developing a second set, version 2 of our specifications, and just having those approved, you might wonder, why did you have to develop a second set of specifications? And that was because sometimes the guidance from the SVI group does change over time. So being one of the older groups, there's been quite a few changes that have happened since our initial specifications. So my advice would be, stay flexible and know that these things are going to change with time, and that's a good thing. I'm a little jealous of the people who are just starting now, because there's more guidance, and that is a good thing. But just because you have one set of specifications doesn't mean that that's the final one. You might have another set or a third set. Who knows? Who knows?
Great advice. All right, let's do a GCEP specific question now. So I'm curious to hear everyone's approach to lumping and splitting. Do you do this for all of your genes or only some? If only some of them, which? Do you find the process beneficial or a barrier? And I'll ask to start with Christian first.
Yes, so we typically go through the exercise of lumping or splitting as part of the pre-curation, so in the ID autism group, because it's not always clear and evident a priori which disease entity to curate that gene for. We actually go through the question of whether to lump or split and which entity to curate under as part of the pre-curation. And I find that very helpful and actually necessary for every gene.
What about you, Christy? What do they do in retina?
Yeah, so we actually took our gene list once we refined it and sent it to our co-chairs, Rob Huffnagel and Gavin Arno, and had sort of pre-marked some genes that we thought probably needed pre-curation and asked them to take a look. If in OMIM the gene really just has one phenotype associated with it, we did not earmark those for pre-curation. If there were multiple phenotypes, or we knew this was a syndromic form, most likely those were earmarked for pre-curation. And then on every call, we'll have some time set aside at the end for pre-curations for upcoming genes that are scheduled. So we do not find it necessary to do it for every gene, but have gone through ahead of time to mark the ones that do require it. And unfortunately, there are quite a few for retina. So probably about 2/3 need it and a third don't. but that'll allow us to save a little bit of time and be able to get through maybe another curation versus doing a pre-curation for those that look a little bit more straightforward. And I've done this with some other groups. Usually this works out well. Every now and then a gene will catch up to you where, you know, probably would have benefited from pre-curation, and we'll just deal with that as it comes. But yeah, we do it on a gene by gene basis.
And Allison, what are your thoughts on this in regards to your new gene disease relationships that you're evaluating?
So I think if they're the new ones, then the likelihood is that there's only one assertion. So I think we don't typically do a full pre-curation if there's only one assertion. But I think if during the most of the new genes have relatively little information available to them, so we don't always manage to do a proper full curation on them. So we've had a couple recently where we've landed sort of somewhere in between a pre-curation and a curation, but I think we only go through the lumping and splitting process when there's more than one assertion, and part of that is time saving. But I think if it comes up during the discussion that we should look at it differently, then we pause and we'll go back and revisit it. But similarly, we went through our list and tried to identify at the beginning which ones we were likely to have to go through lumping and splitting, and which ones we could avoid that.
And Z, any final word from the hereditary cancer GCEP on this?
Yeah, so we discussed lumping and splitting for all the colon cancer and the breast ovarian cancer genes for recuration on the hereditary cancer GCEP call, because it is a big issue for those two first GCEP. And but for other genes, we only discuss lumping splitting if there is an issue during the pre-curation from the curator. So we recently also noticed that there is example for APC. The expert in the expert panel decided to have a split gastric cancer curation, but there is no OMIM term there. So we contact OMIM, and the OMIM team add a new disease term under APC for our split curation. And there are also many examples from GCEP VCEP that we required new or changed the Mondo terms for the curation, based on the lumping splitting decision from the expert panels.
Wonderful, thanks, Xi. Well, we'd like to thank all of you for being wonderful panelists for this discussion. This has been a really enlightening discussion, and we thank you for all of your service to ClinGen and all of your time, and also the answers you provided on this panel. So at this point, we're going to turn it over to the second panel and to Courtney Thaxton, who will be moderating that panel. Thank you, everyone.